So before I begin, I want to talk about how Ron Roberts has a lot of these. He goes through the whole history of psychology and, for example, points out lobotomy as a problem. But really, there's no, like, for example, lobotomy. But I'm not going to go through all of that. I mean, it's obvious that lobotomy is problematic. And I'm not going to talk about the straw man here. I'm going to go talk about the really difficult subjects that he does talk about and the really difficult subjects that he absolutely is unable to recognize. So here we go with the reading. Eventually, as the power of the nation states increased, large-scale systems for the insane sprang up, housing mainly poor people. By 1800, there were about 5,000 in England confined in these asylums, out of a population of 10 million. The aim of the early mental hospitals was social reform, not healing. And within the mantle of social reform lurked the shadow of social control. Around this time, a new, quote, moral, quote, treatment of the inmates of asylums became fashionable throughout Europe and the United States, challenging the biological stance of medicine. So this is, of course, absolutely still happening. If you go to prisons today, there is a psychologist that comes into your prison cell and he tries to peddle drugs on you to try to solve the problem. And there's for every 1,000 inmates, even in Canada, there's one psychologist, and there's way more psychiatrists than there are psychologists to deal with this. And psychiatrists don't talk to you, they peddle drugs on you. So we can see how Foucault's critique of these institutions didn't actually change them. What happened was, again, what I was trying to say before. In 1972, Tim Challis said that psychologists, by investigating the nature of brainwashing, have improved it. They don't try to actually take on the difficulties of the brain. They try to manipulate the brain into doing what you want it to do. This is what we call social control, rather than actual pedagogy, rather than what is right now also totally within the institution, which is Paulo Freire's work on pedagogy. So there's this particular person who wished to eradicate what he saw as celibacy, promiscuity, apathy, laziness, and to do this by having his charge internalize authority to police their own behavior. So people have to, this is what the Foucault calls as the panopticon. The purveyors of moral management have lacked any institutional power base, and so medicine eventually reasserted its authority, professionalized the asylums, and imposed a biological dogma on public understanding of the people imprisoned there. Not all agreed. Very interesting. The management of madness, if you look at Foucault's history of madness as well, and psychological distress is pivotal to the establishment of psychiatry as a social force, and arguably also central to its development along with that of psychology. The continuing popularity of psychology is fed in part by a desire amongst its followers, students, academics, therapists, that it will somehow deliver to them the knowledge of how to live a better life and escape from the pitfalls of psychological pains they and we all endure. One thing that has really brought me peace is the possibility that healing isn't possible, that we really need to linger within our pain rather than this therapy culture where everybody's always trying to narcissistically heal. I think that, we can just sit with the fact that many people have diabetes and many different issues that they don't have to heal. They can just live as they are. We can deal with that as a society in a positive way, rather than trying to gaslight them and saying it's, this kind of societal problem is your individual psychological problem, as we are doing now. This is a seriously misplaced wish, as Roberts says. And again, I said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, a really good idiom, but the gates of heaven is only opened by the devil's advocate. And this is my own idiom, right? And this is what we've done with seeing the devil's advocate as a toxic masculinity, as a form of toxic masculinity, because cognitive behavioral therapy is supposedly supposed to be the be-all and end-all of our existence. By the way, I do have a cognitive behavioral therapy certification, and I'm very critical of it, even though it's been very helpful in many ways. And it's a mediation, right? It's a mediation between what works and also to see what are your own psychological problems from society's psychological problems, to be able to see and recognize what belongs to you and what belongs to other people, and how when people react, even psychologists, when they react to you, they are really talking about their own issues they're projecting. But it could also be the case that this is something that's greater than all of us, right? And so when you talk about these societal issues, especially when philosophers talk about these societal issues, please look at my video on paranoia and psychology, which is like the precursor to this. When philosophers do this, like Diogenes and Socrates, when they talk about these psychological issues that are really part of our whole society and how we need to heal our society, they become scapegoats, right? So this is my kind of anti-Christian, anti-messianic perspective that I've kind of developed recently, because in Christianity, you're supposed to kind of you're supposed to like do what Jesus do, and Jesus is supposed to be this ultimate role model for us. However, the problem is that, and this is my problem with Christianity, that there's so many people, there's so many scapegoats in our society, and all these people are scapegoated for other people's sins. And I just don't understand that. And that's what's really making the atheist part of my Christianity much more powerful than the Christian part of my Christianity. Okay. So back to the text. The major influences on our lives, we believe, are those we can most easily see, emanating from one's friends, lovers, family, and associates. But the larger, more powerful forces in society lie unseen and remote and forever untheorized by psychologists. Psychologists do not have the tools to understand some things like collective trauma. They cannot deal with this, because their whole philosophy, their whole edifice relies on this history of subjectivity, this neoliberal subjectivity, as I discuss in my Ritual Traces series regarding the history of subjectivity. So psychologists are unable to theorize. They don't have the tool to theorize about the process of collective trauma. That's something that's in the spiritual world, and unfortunately the spirituality has also been invaded by these neoliberal idioms as well, so it's really difficult. So that's why I look to philosophy, because philosophy doesn't do that, and that's what the conflict of the faculties is all about. Madness, back to the text, madness, symbolically at least, points to something beyond our understanding, an invitation to another more frightening world than the one we know. The attraction of the arts of psychiatry and psychology for students and state alike is to tame this beast and thereby gain power over the terrible unknown. And that's what this psychology is really motivated by, this hysteria, especially with regards to toxic masculinity and all this stuff. It's really this terrible unknown that is essentialized in a way, and they try to take over it, and when really it's the barbarians at the gates, right? And the apparent absence of reason to be found in mad serves to strengthen and legitimize the importance which the Enlightenment has given to it, and to which young disciples of psychology and psychiatry have hitched a ride. The myth of reason, as the cure of all ills, was a child of the Enlightenment, and once unleashed, knew no bounds. Its corresponding dark side is the fear of insanity. Goya's famous etching, created at the 18th century, drew to a close. The sleep of reason produces monsters, expresses this fear in a nightmarish vision. Writing in the 19th century, Marx saw this increasing lunatic population as a direct consequence of capitalism. But this was a view from the fringe. With medicine firmly in the ascendancy, Marx's view would almost sink without a trace. And I love this idea of without a trace, right? And I keep coming back to this without a trace. If you're interested in that without a trace notion, go to my Sloterdijk video on Derrida and Egyptian and take a study of that. And another really poignant point within my Ritual Traces series that you can find is that it is only through madness, not through this externalization of madness, but only through madness can we find subjectivity. It is within the void that we are able to become a full subject for ourselves, right? But the whole institutional way of doing things is to see madness as if they are barbarians at the gates or something like that. The medicalization of madness, and I would say the clinicalization of masculinity, which Ron Roberts fails to see. This book was written before the 2015 work. I think actually around the same time, so I'm not really sure. Contributed to the medicalization of madness, contributed to two key pillars of thought, which were to play an important role in securing the, quote, scientific credentials of psychology. Again, psychology is 100% soft sciences, right? And what's funny is, and I'm going to be talking about this in my virtue signaling video, how psychology, feminist psychology, positions itself against evolutionary psychology. But I'm going to be talking about how they both agree in many respects on many different topics. And this kind of scientific credentials is one of them. Chief amongst these was the viability of diagnosing, classifying, and categorizing troublesome people. Exactly. That's what we're doing again with toxic masculinity. This penchant for labeling and pigeonholing people via the use of scientific sounding labels, preferably with Latin or Greek etymology, fed off the lure of Enlightenment thinking and was taken up with gusto by the new psychoanalytic movement led by Freud at the end of the 19th century. Now, there's a big disagreement about our interpretations of Freud, and that's why psychoanalysis and psychology are really opposed to one another, and that's a whole other topic. The view that Freud helped promulgate that mental illness was ubiquitous, nobody was exempt, has obviously been a seminal import for the pharmaceutical companies of the 20th and 21st centuries wishing to expand their markets and peddle cures for non-existent illnesses. Amazing. What is particularly interesting about the history of both psychoanalysis and psychology is that they show these disciplines effectively behaving like businesses themselves, perennially advertising their wares, making a point of enlarging their sphere of influence in the absence of any real evidence to support their claims of efficacy. The lure of categorizing was followed closely by the notion that the behavioral characteristics which underpinned these systems of classification were a result of hereditary influences. This notion found enthusiastic champions in the English upper classes, most notably Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who was a pioneer in that peculiarly English contribution to intellectual thought, eugenics.
She's hardworking and has a good reputation.
Do you know anything about her family background?
Oh, yes, Your Honor, I do.
There are several other children, aren't there?
Yes?
What is their condition?
One is a cripple, two others might be classed as feeble-minded.
Isn't the oldest son in jail?
Oh, yes, I believe so.
And knowing all that, you still contend that this girl should be allowed to bring more people like that into the world?
She's sound, Your Honor. She's not anything like the rest. Surely she should be given a chance to work out her own salvation.
I can't agree with you, Doctor. Suppose she is normal. The chances are that her children will inherit the family taint. Isn't that possible?
The Nazis used this philosophy to bolster their racial pseudoscience. It enjoyed popular support amongst German psychologists of the day. Richards reminds us that it was psychologists who supported the Nazi regime who were at the forefront of the recognition of professional psychology. 1994, page 457. The twin study method, beloved but flawed methodology used by psychologists in the investigation of genetic influences on behavior, was created in the midst of the National Socialist era by regime-supporting scientists. psychology has been a regular accomplice to mass crime. Indeed, it was a key part of the greatest mass crime in history, the Holocaust, and no doubt will be part of the next one. Its usefulness to the surveillance society and its able contributions to the reifications of all form of disobedience, whether political, social, or interpersonal, as individual dysfunction. Amazing. So I'm going to pause here and say 2 points. The first point is that this stuff was happening before the Nazi regime. If you've watched the final episode of my Ritual Traces series, the defender in the Nuremberg trials, the defender of these trials, they were talking about how, the American states had similar psychological programs, and they were trying to have their own eugenics programs backed by their own psychologists. So it's not really specific to the Nazis. And secondly, what I want to say is, just as we are seeing that there's toxic masculinity, the Chinese, for example, they point to their Islamicists, and they are saying that these Islamic people have psychological problems and they need to be re-educated and sent to re-education camps. So it's very similar to what we do here with regards to toxic masculinity.
What China has done to actual terrorists in providing economic opportunities and re-education because they're terrorists is somehow worse. Thousands of people did not die. They were provided an alternative lifestyle. And it's eradicated the terrorism issue.
Galton was the son of a banker from an extended family which contained many rich bankers. He set about trying to demonstrate that high intelligence was inborn, effectively rubber stamping the social position of the wealthy, gifted people he studied. In Galton's eyes, it was they who were the most intelligent and duly endowed by nature in the grand tradition of British justificatory rhetoric were destined to rule. In his theoretical formulations, intelligence, it transpired, behaved exactly like money. And you can see how this neoliberal religion has infested all disciplines. There was marked inequality in the amount which people possessed, and what they did have could be passed on to their offspring, while the mechanism for the transfer of money was simple, legal, and social expedients. The inheritance of the propensity for intelligence was some presumed biological mastery. Not surprisingly, these notions were taken up with gusto by ideologues of the ruling class. Galton's ideas, like those of social Darwinists in general, in effect legitimized inequality. These were the same ideas of biological determinism which were since have been employed to legitimize unrestrained capitalism as the highest and inevitable expressions of human nature. And I would argue that this same process is still continuing, but under the guise of progressive capitalism, which is even way more dangerous. The complexity of the processes involved in examining genetic material, as well as the difficulties involved in appreciating the limitations of mathematical models, has allowed them to not only make unsupportable claims, but to avoid any critical public scrutiny of their methods. That's another big no-no, right? You're not even allowed to critique these processes, right? So if you go and try to search, critique of intersectionality, it's so difficult to find. And Zero Books has this interview with Zizek where I talk about in one of my videos, they talk about how even the prohibition is prohibited to talk about. And this kind of Stalinist kind of way of moving forward that the left is doing, which is totally not correct and totally making the Nazism grow in the shadows. One factor in this is the nature of the press. Firstly, most journalists do not possess the technical knowledge they require to challenge what they are told, and secondly, significant sections of the press are in any case attached to the same ideological agenda as the researchers, i.e. neoliberalism. Belief in the importance of genetic influences over environmental ones is, of course, a regular feature of right-wing political discourse. And again, I would say that the left-wing political discourse says that there's social construction and we can control these social constructionism is also just as problematic, just as authoritarian, and just as narcissistic. Any change required must take place in the people exposed to it. This is the message that psychology routinely reinforces. Business as usual prevails, big business and bad science. So they sneak in political and moral claims into science. What is psychology? By the beginning of the 20th century, with an experimental and statistical form of psychology gaining acceptance, it was obvious that there was no longer any continuity between the original use of the term psychology and the present-day one. Though contemporary psychology sometimes still describes itself as the science of mind and behavior, few practitioners think that the mind has any useful reference beyond a metaphorical one or a means to lure and maintain public interest. So there's a difference between mind and brain. Psychology's early meaning, at least, had the virtue of possessing a single focus, a desire to understand the so-called soul and to develop knowledge of it. The psychology which stepped into the limelight in the 20th century had none of this. As the birth of its experimental inception, the holy grail for practitioners was to have professional recognition and academic recognizability conferred on them. So this kind of credential system is really problematic for psychology because you can't have, everybody doing psychology. So you have to have this institutionalized system. But this institutionalization also then biases the whole system towards agreeing with the system itself, right? The way they believed they would get this was for psychology to have scientific status. They sought to court a wider public opinion rather than address the deeply difficult problem that they lacked any integrated theory of emotion, thought, and behavior. This was, in essence, what Freud had attempted at the expense, it turned out, of wider acceptance of psychoanalysis as a science. Wundt and other psychophysiologists of his generation surrendered in the face of this difficulty and turned to anything that was amenable to quantification. Reaction times, the number of items in a list one could remember, the duration of simple perceptual events. In the 21st century, with a shining array of technology, from the EEG, which measures the strength of electrical signals emanating from the brain, to the MRI, which indicates which regions of the brain are active, the problem is much the same. No baseline theory to connect the wealth of data these machines produce. With no theory to capture or explain or understands what it means to be human, the subject remains tied to quantification for quantification's sake. Psychology seems unable to agree on what their subject is, or even how to study it. So this subject itself is a matter of quantification, emotional labor calculation, what I call this kind of endless capitalization of efficiency. It sneaks in these cultural paradigms because it doesn't have a explanation of its own. It just conforms to the system as a whole. The role of psychology today isn't to necessarily help us heal, but it's just to help us deal with what we are facing. And how we can deal is by, having value, building utility, all of these kinds of things that you see all over Instagram today, but that make our individuals very strong, but actually destroy the collective society, that destroy community, that take away communal possibility. So because of this void, Roberts sees that there are major rifts that permeate the discipline. However, I'm going to be arguing against this major rifts, and I'm going to say that it doesn't matter all the different types of psychology, evolutionary psychology, intersectional psychology, they are all in the same boat in my eyes from a philosophy perspective. There is an inability to agree on what the focus should be on, what people do or say, what they think or what they feel. There are further divisions concerning what the appropriate aims of research should be, on the discipline it's trying to achieve, as well as the methods appropriated to try and achieve these aims. Perhaps the only thing that psychologists who call themselves scientists seem to be able to agree on is that their science involves the measurement and or classification of people into distinct types or categories, and that appropriate procedures to test hypotheses involve the use of statistical tests.